on steroids. If you're old enough to drink alcohol, you are old enough to do steroids. I don't say that as an effort to be provocative. I'm not just trying to make a splash, nor am I trying to rationalize my own drug-addled history, because I don't have one. Even in my bodybuilding days, I never did any hormone-targeted supplement, legal or illegal. I did calories and creatine. So this isn't an elaborate justification of my own bank of poor life choices. This is an honest, sober appraisal of steroids. And if you listen to the whole length of this chapter, and if things like facts are important to you, if facts are what you use to make decisions, then you will come to appreciate that the steroid controversy isn't even controversial. You'll understand why any law that prohibits, or otherwise punishes, steroid use should equally apply to Pabst and possibly Tylenol. But not everyone is willing to listen to things like facts and reason, which is why steroids have so many opponents. And those opponents have created a lot of arguments. Those arguments cover topics such as steroids aren't natural, and they make sports unfair, and they cause health problems. There are a lot more anti-steroid positions, but those three are the holy trinity of opposition. I'll address each of them, as well as all of the minor arguments, throughout this chapter, and I'll explain why every single one of them is total nonsense. Some of these explanations have been picked up and paraphrased, or otherwise plagiarized, from a researcher at Willamette University named Peter Harmer. Peter tends to be the most articulate courier of reason on this subject, and his Australian accented delivery helps shuttle the message with a bit more finesse. But before we get there, before we break down all of the anti-steroid arguments, it seems fair to ask, what is a steroid? Chemistry aside, a steroid is a type of ergogenic aid. Ergogenic aids are things that help an athlete perform better. This isn't just stuff you put in your mouth, or inject, or inhale, or rub all creamily into your skin, or ram into your vagina, i.e. suppository. Ergogenic aids fall into three classes: mechanical, psychological, and physiological. Psychological aids are things like positive self-talk, hypnosis, whatever. Mechanical aids are better cleats, a pre-bent fiberglass vaulting pole, a baseball bat made out of some alloy that weighs nothing, etc. And physiological aids include steroids, and creatine, and caffeine, and vitamins, and water, and genetics. Some of these are totally unregulated, i.e. vitamins. Others are conditionally legal, inhalers, etc. And others are Schedule III controlled substances, which mere possession on a first offense is a federal crime that can earn you up to a year in prison, i.e. steroids. The legal differences between these aids need to be justified by reason, because you can't make decisions about laws arbitrarily and then expect people to accept those decisions and respect those laws. So we'll talk about the reasons people give in support of their anti-steroid positions, and then I will explain why those reasons are terrible. We'll begin with the most tedious and untenable argument, that there's no reason to argue because there's no evidence that steroids even work and thus no reason to do them. This rather silly proposition is made possible by the fact that it's tough to get an IRB to approve a study design that proposes to inject healthy 20-somethings with 800 milligrams of testosterone every Monday and then track how much they bench or how fast they sprint or how far they put the shot. Traditionally, you either give healthy people useless doses, maybe 100 milligrams a week, or you work with a pathology like HIV-related wasting, and in that case, you get great results. Or the other option is you look at animal models, or epidemiological surveillance, where the data come from observation rather than an intervention. The point is, the data are sufficient, but the most interesting data come from bench science. This is where people figure out the ways in which steroids alter one's chemistry, and the alteration of that chemistry is how the steroids actually work. This is what allows us to explain things like that double peak on a bodybuilder's biceps. There's no way the pennation angle of the fibers would change to that magnitude without drugs. Outside of bodybuilding, this isn't really an advantage, especially in sports with a linear nature, things like javelin or even Olympic lifting, but it looks cool. Or at least it looks weird, and weird is interesting, and interesting is an entertainment, and entertainments engender careers. In short, steroids work, and there's a reason why people do them. On the physiological level, they work by changing the expression of your genes. When you inject a dose of testosterone into one of your glute cheeks, it'll eventually find its way to the target cells, the target muscle cells. It'll pass the membranes of those cells and bind to androgen receptors. Unless you're old and don't have a very vigorous lifting history, then you probably don't have very many receptors. So your body will just have to figure out ways to dispose of all that excess testosterone. Those ways include converting it into stuff like dihydrotestosterone, which messes up your prostate. But if you're young and full of vigor, the testosterone will bind to androgen receptors. This binding will alter gene expression, and that will do things like increase your myonuclei, i.e. muscle cell nucleuses. Most cells in the human body have a single nucleus. Muscle cells, like cancer cells, are multinucleated. They have to be because they're huge relative to all the other cells in your body. And the nucleus of each cell contains all of your genes, and the biological domain governed by a single nucleus is only so large. So if you want to see a cell become larger, you'd better give it some more nuclei. Only so much growth and development can be accomplished per nucleus. With the cycle of steroids, you see increases in the number of myonuclei, and through that, the possibility of protein accretion through a larger domain. In rats, this elevated number appears to go away after a while. It might only last a couple weeks, depending on a lot. But humans are the creatures who play football, not rats. And among these football-playing humans, the penalty for testing positive is a month, 30 days on the bench. The funny part is that rats only live for a few years, which that alone is not funny, but half of a month relative to a rat's lifespan is a fairly long time. A whole month relative to a human's lifespan is not nearly as long. And among us upright folk, inclined to play or otherwise appreciate football, the myonucleic perks appear to last many more moons. And this is one explanation of where muscle memory comes from. And it makes the 30-day penalty seem as arbitrary as every other steroid law, rule, or policy. This doesn't mean steroids alone will cause growth, though. Without activation of the motor unit, there's no adaptation. We'll get to that later. But given all the right conditions, steroids clearly work and work well. A small dose of androgens and you'll feel a bit younger. A big dose and the vigorous find athletic actualization. Can steroids be abused? Of course. Do people who take steroids usually know what they're doing? Of course not. Just travel back in time and ask the Bulgarians. Bulgaria's reputation for mothering, hulking, veiny weightlifters is partly a vestige of the 1950s when steroids were still legal in the Olympic Games. They weren't banned until the 60s, and technically the first Olympic athlete to test positive for a banned substance was not a Bulgarian weightlifter, but a Swedish pentathlete, who was stripped of his bronze due to alcohol. But before the International Olympic Committee announced their ban on performance-enhancing drugs, like steroids and alcohol, researchers did a fair amount of testing. They wanted to know what kinds of effects these drugs had on the body, on the human body. And the Bulgarians were the most interesting subjects to research. The conversations presumably went something like this. Excuse me, Bulgarian, I'm going to need a urine sample. Bulgarian. Oh, okay, just a sec. Let me go get my catheter. What? Yeah, we work out a lot. What? Well, we work out so much that we need catheters, obviously. Huh. At this point, I assume the researchers broke the news to them that it wasn't the workouts that were necessitating the use of catheters. The much more likely culprit would be the giant doses of drugs. It was just too much. The excess had to be sent somewhere, and somewhere wound up in the prostate. The East Germans are another great example. In 1972, the women won 5 total medals. No golds, definitely no records. They weren't good. 4 years of drugs later, those women won 18 medals, 11 of them gold, and set 8 world records. There were only 12 individual events that year. They won gold in 10 of them. And at the end of those races, you'd see the wet champ hoist one of her arms in the air, clenching a fist into the international gesture of victory. And beneath that fist was a giant man arm. Then the owner of that man arm would climb out of the pool and start celebrating with a booming man voice. When those voices were called into question, one of the East German coaches dismissed that question with, "We came here to swim, not sing." The point of all this is to illustrate that what we have here is a set of chemicals that can produce great effects and side effects, depending on how they're used. And this is what leads to the debate of whether they should be used. Most people think, quite strongly, no, they should never be used. But the reasons they give in support of this position are all nonsense. The most obvious, and ostensibly valid, argument concerns the athlete's health. At what cost do these perks arrive? What happens to the athlete himself or himself, assuming the her cells have already become himself? Is the athlete's health so compromised that it isn't worth the benefits? If the answer to that question is yes, that would be the argument being made here. But it's not a very convincing argument, because even if the athlete's health was so compromised, why would you care? Where do you come in? Your health isn't being affected. The athlete presumably knew the side effects, probably believed the risks to be far worse than they actually are, and made a relatively informed decision. Again, where do you come in? The health risk has nothing to do with you. No athlete has ever done drugs to you. Unless you're a football group with no Y chromosome, then you've probably been roofied. But that's an actual crime with an actual victim. This isn't. There's no victim here. Lance Armstrong and Barry Bonds and all the other athletes you're mad at have never done drugs to you. So why is their health your argument? If you're genuinely concerned with an athlete's physical well-being, anything with comparably adverse effects should be banned. If an athlete decides to carb load with 30 packs of Peeps and winds up with diabetes, would you be making the same argument? Would you be moved to levy a legal ceiling of pre-competition Peep consumption? My hunch is no, although there's no difference. But even if there was a difference, you still wouldn't be affected by either scenario. The Jose Cansecos of the world are not on welfare, living in Section 8 housing, trading food stamps for beer money. So you're not paying for them. You didn't buy Arnold Schwarzenegger's heart surgery. Their steroids don't affect you physically or financially. Somehow they still affect you emotionally, but that doesn't matter. As long as you're not affected in a meaningful way, people get to choose what they do to their own bodies. You don't get to choose for them. And how do they make those choices all by themselves? They weigh the pros and cons. And steroids, just like Peeps and Roofies and Cabbage and Naps and Honey Badgers, have pros and cons. So let's talk about the pros and cons of steroids. We already know the pros. They work. They help you do things like swim really fast. But what are the cons? What are the side effects? Well, this depends on a lot. If we're talking testosterone, a couple hundred milligrams a week probably isn't producing any. Get up to 800 and you'll start seeing those side effects. Double that because you want to have a bigger back than Ronnie Coleman and your physiology gets a little weird. But even among the bodybuilders taking 12 or 1,500 milligrams a day, you don't see them dying at age 35. They're not living to 100, but they do end up competing in the Masters division. They're in their 50s and still on stage in giant bikinis. Granted, we're not looking at liver panels here, but the megadoses aren't as acutely lethal as people would have you believe. But it wouldn't matter even if they were. The abuse of steroids isn't relevant. This goes back to the Peeps argument. You can kill yourself with Tylenol if you abuse it. You can kill yourself with vitamins if you abuse them. Drink too much water and you can die. Now you could say, oh, it's way easier to abuse steroids than it is to abuse Tylenol, but that's not even close to true. So if your argument is that steroids should be illegal because their abuse can be lethal, there's nothing in the world that could withstand that legislation. The rational question is, what are the risks associated with appropriate doses of steroids? A handful of Peeps. The first risks we can eliminate are gender changes and the necessitation of catheters. That won't happen if you aren't being ridiculous with your dose. You might see some side effects like pimples and mood changes, but who cares? I mean, let's be honest. If you had a multi-million-dollar contract on the line, would a couple temporary back zits really weigh into your decision? The question itself is sufficient as an answer. The side effects that matter are those that would compromise your actual health, and among those, unfavorable changes to one's cholesterol may be the most discussed. When you take an oral anabolic steroid, it goes into your mouth, from your mouth to your gut, and then straight into your portal circulation. You have three major blood vessel systems. The portal vein is one of those three. It's the road that goes from your gut to your liver. The other two are your regular arteries and veins, the ones you think of when I talk about circulation, and your pulmonary arteries and veins, the cargo route to and from your lungs. Because your liver is what controls all of your lipid levels, HDLs, LDLs, triglycerides, that stuff, the first pass portal metabolism of oral anabolic steroids will affect your profile. You see the same effect when women take estrogen orally, but those women can bypass these changes if they take their estrogen by other means, injections, patches, vaginal suppository, whatever. Likewise, you'll experience the lipid compromising, mostly HDL lowering effects if you eat stanozolol, the Ben Johnson drug, but if you just shut your mouth and go for the needle, you can bypass a lot of that. Another common concern is the remodeling of the heart one sees with prolonged steroid exposure, more specifically left ventricular hypertrophy. The left ventricle is one of the two pumping chambers of the heart. The right ventricle pumps your blood into your pulmonary circulation. The left ventricle pumps blood into everything else, except the portal vein. If your heart's ability to pump is decreased, you're in trouble. With steroid use, you do see a slight thickening of the wall. This results in the dimensions of the pumping chamber becoming a bit narrower, so the heart has to compensate by pumping faster. If you want to maintain the same cardiac output, but the heart isn't pumping as much blood with each stroke, it's going to have to put out a couple extra strokes per minute. The math here should make sense. And while this could be problematic, you'd have to do an awful lot of drugs to get a meaningful effect. Plus, if you just adjust for whole body mass, the heart isn't that much bigger. What this means is that if all you did was wake up in the morning with another 15 pounds of lean body mass, having no idea where it came from, but knowing it didn't come from drugs, your heart would have to remodel itself in order to compensate for that. And once it did, it wouldn't look that much different from the steroid heart. Steroid hearts are thicker, yes, but so is your entire skeletal muscle system. This creates a need for additional circulation. Even without the steroids, your heart will adapt to accommodate. So lift weights without steroids or grow for any other reason like puberty, and you're going to see a similar effect on the heart. You can exacerbate this with steroids, but the effect is it's not that enormous, especially when it gets compared to actual hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a genetic condition that really thickens the heart. Moving on to the final side effect that really matters. All the other side effects are largely imaginary or blown way out of proportion. This one is another liver issue. If you're taking oral steroids, and that first metabolic checkpoint is thus your liver, on that liver, blood-filled cysts can form. If these cysts rupture, that's a problem. You bleed into your gut. If you bleed into your muscle, the muscle will compress the bleed and ultimately stop it. You don't have that same safety net with your gut, so this is bad. But again, if your steroids are not being swallowed, you avoid that first pass hepatic metabolism and the severity of the side effects that tend to go along with it. Now, am I saying all this as an effort to convince you that steroids aren't harmful? No, steroids are potentially plenty harmful. And it's especially important for kids to know this, because they're much more impressionable than the later life versions of themselves. They all think they're invincible. A lot of elite athletes are 20 years old. They've never seen death. Even their grandparents are alive. It's hard to have any appreciation for just how terminal death is, and fragile the life that precedes it, if you've never had a 50-year-old set of experiences. But having said that, Tylenol can do the same amount of harm. Among high school athletes, ibuprofen frequently does. It just harms different body systems. So it's important to know that steroids, like ibuprofen, can very easily cause side effects. They just aren't as bad as people think they are. When you look for actual legitimate evidence that steroids are dangerous when taken appropriately, it's just not there. But the potential for some harm to the liver and cardiovascular system is definitely an issue. And the issue brings us to the next argument against the use of steroids, namely the unnecessary risk for harm and the social coercion that facilitates it. The basic argument here is that because some people are breaking the law on doing steroids, in order to compete at that level, you now have to do steroids too. You're being coerced into it because there's no other way to keep up, and this puts you at an undue risk for harm. This is a terrible argument, starting with social coercion, which isn't even an argument in the first place because nobody in the Western world is forced to compete at any level in anything. In most major sports, steroids are likely to be a requisite part of elite competition, but you are not obligated in any way to compete at that level. And if this is a problem to you, you clearly don't understand how the world works. Let's say you want to be in the NFL. Steroids are probably necessary, and at the dose you would be taking, you may experience some minor side effects. That's not part of some socio-political or legislative problem. It's part of the game. You're guaranteed to experience a lot of major side effects when 300-pound men hit you as hard as they can. That, too, is part of the game. So if you want to be in the NFL, but you don't want to do steroids, that's like saying, I want to be in the NFL, but I don't want people to hit me very hard. That's the game, and you don't have to play. Nobody's making you. This point leads us into the second half of the argument, the undue risk for harm, and we'll continue with football as our example. Just about everyone who has ever played the game, at least at the professional level, has experienced a good deal of spinal compression. Each season, every player has somewhere in the range of an 80% chance of injury, which makes the average career about 3.5 years long, 6 if you're an optimist with enough exclusionary criteria. Even outside of the NFL, when you start evaluating youth leagues, you're finding almost 50,000 surgical procedures a year. How many steroid-related surgeries do you know of? How many ex-football players spend their remaining years hobbling around because of a couple cycles of DECA? How much pain and trauma has come from the steroids? I don't have an answer, but I can assure you it's nowhere near as much as can be attributed to football. Why, then, I wonder, are the risks associated with steroids undue when the do-ness isn't even discussed in football. It seems obvious that it's the sport that's killing the athletes, not the drugs. The incidence of steroid-related harm is like 1,000th the rate of sport-related harm, and nobody's arguing that because the sport is 1,000 times riskier than steroids, it should be 1,000 times more illegal. We blame steroids when what we should be blaming is the sport. You're going to be hurt in football. There's no question about that. Every player gets hurt. That's not considered an undue risk. But let's say you're a college player, and there's a 3% chance you'll have compromised liver function, and a 90% chance you'll sign an $8 million contract if you supplement your practice schedule with steroids. Can you really pretend that this would be an undue risk? In football alone, you will get hurt for nothing. This isn't undue. But with steroids, where there's a slight risk of side effects against a 90% chance of being a millionaire, this is somehow undue. Even if we ignore sports and their contracts, look at alcohol. This damages the liver too. Not a lot of controversy here. The only differences are that you can't avoid a large portion of those side effects by injecting it, and you don't get any physical or financial reward by consuming it. How is that risk not undue? Clearly, steroids are a due risk, certainly more due than participation in the sport itself, and the idea of social coercion is a non-argument. The next argument is that steroids are unfair. They create an unlevel playing field. If I'm competing naturally, it's not fair that I have to go up against someone who isn't. Like the social coercion argument, this one only makes sense if you refuse to think about it. If a law existed that only allowed specific athletes access to steroids, then yes, that would be unfair. But if steroids were legal, then the only thing that could be unfair about them is the price. If one athlete can afford them and another can't, that's an unlevel playing field. But that applies to everything. Let's invent two baseball players. One of them grew up with a dad who could afford better cleats, better mitts, better bats, better coaches, nutritionists, supplements, gym memberships, and personal trainers, and coins for the batting cage. The other had a dad who was in prison, and his mom couldn't afford equipment, but he loved the sport, so he grew up playing it in the road with rocks and sticks. When the kid who practiced with sticks gets cut from the high school team, how is that fair? He could have worked 10 times as hard as the rich kid. If anything denotes an unlevel playing field, that's it. And it's not just baseball, it's any sport. If you're riding Lance Armstrong's bike, it's not fair that I have to race against you on the Huffy I was able to afford by taking on a second paper route. Or if I had to learn how to play basketball barefoot in the wilderness, the sport doesn't care. The sport only cares if the ball goes in the hoop. Or how about the genetic lottery? It doesn't matter how hard you try. Someone with better genes can easily be better than you with less work. Is that fair? It's a totally unearned advantage that's only available to specific people through no effort of their own. If someone is born with horrible genes and another with the genetics to succeed with minimal effort, why would it be unethical if the unfortunate one attempted to compensate for that genetic discrepancy? He wouldn't be able to actually level the genetic turf. He'd just be changing the expression of his bad genes to split the difference a little. Let's say the boy who played baseball in the street with sticks had worse genetics than his financially equipped counterpart. But that boy worked 10 times as hard, supplemented that work with a cycle of steroids, and managed to eke out a win. He'd be accused of having an unfair advantage over the other kid. He cheated. Everyone would read the local paper and ridicule him. This is crazy, though, because he was the one with the disadvantage who did everything he could to overcome it. This is the kid who deserved good genes, but didn't get them. There's nothing in the universe that's less fair or equal than genetics, so someone who overpowers a genetic disadvantage should be celebrated. But he's not. The one with the favorable genes is celebrated. "I was born this way" is not a statement of modesty. It's not a dismissal of credit. Steroids, on the other hand, are available to everyone who chooses to use them. Cost aside, nothing could be more fair, no field more level. And the cost is much less prohibitive than things like private coaching and proper nutrition and fancy equipment. So steroids have nothing to do with the fairness of play. Anyone who says otherwise is merely making an excuse for why they failed in life. It's just a way for the talentless to blame the devoted. Next argument. Steroids strip the soul from the sport. They contravene the very spirit of the sports we've come to cherish. The implication here is that if we were to eliminate doping, we would have the sport in its purest form. The athletes could then compete against each other as God intended. The people who make this argument often allude to the ancient Olympics as an image of perfection, a paragon of sportsmanship and virtue and ethics and morality. Well, this is definitely the most poetic argument against steroids. It needs to be said that sports don't have spirits or souls. They are entertainments, nothing more. And those entertainments were never clean. Just because the ancient Greeks hadn't isolated testosterone yet doesn't mean the athletes were competing as purely as is allowed by the human form. They were exactly as dirty as we are. We know this because they, like us, were human beings. And this is what humans do. It's how we behave. The only difference is that our ergogenic aids actually work. Ours are based in science. The ancient Greeks were swallowing a bunch of plant seeds and potions, essentially anything they thought would give them the slightest advantage so that Zeus might be proud. Ground up tigers, whatever, eat it all. They were even drugging the horses in the chariot races. No group of humans has ever approached athletic competition with a devotion to biological purity. One might expect the Vikings to use herbs and shrooms to pillage with more vigor, but when it comes to sports, everyone is a Viking. Those everyones just didn't have access to more sophisticated aids until the 19th century, when things like caffeine and opium started being used. But at every stage in human history, athletes took everything they thought would help. In the 1860s, swimmers in Amsterdam were taking speedballs, which were mixtures of heroin and cocaine. In 1904, Thomas Hicks collapsed, quite famously, across the finish line of his gold medal marathon, hopped up on a combination of brandy and strychnine. It wasn't until 1935 that testosterone was first synthesized, and the 1950s when anabolic steroids were becoming available. But forget the steroids. If the ancient Greeks even had access to things like speedballs, brandy, and strychnine, they would have been collapsing across finish lines too. Even if that weren't true, though, even if the origin of sports was as sportsmanlike as the sentimentalists wish it was, why would that matter? There's nothing inherently valuable about any sport. Sports come and go. We invent them and then they disappear. In the 21st century, I'm sure the head count of dead sports outnumbers the living. The only ones we participate in today are those that currently entertain us. The moment a sport ceases to entertain, it ceases to exist. And you have to admit that the Olympics would be way more entertaining if world records were shattered every single time you watched it. No Bulgarian has peed out of a urethra since puberty, but they're snatching 3,000 pounds. That would be entertaining. If you think otherwise, let me plug this same principle into a different outlet. The pleasure one experiences in watching a sport is not unlike the pleasure experienced when watching a movie. So I'll give you two viewing options. First, you can watch a partially silent but very artistic French film that characterizes existentialism in the 1940s to create a touching portrait of the human condition. Or, you can watch an American blockbuster with an explosion budget that exceeds $200 million and is partially filmed on the moon. One of these movies takes effort to watch, the other is easily enjoyed. It takes no energy to be acutely entertained by the spectacular. That's the difference between watching a sport in its pure form, appreciating its spirit, and watching that same sport enhanced by steroids. The spectacular is guaranteed to entertain. The funny part is, it's the people who are exhilarated by ridiculous exploding action movies that are the most adamant about keeping steroids out of sports. I think they're failing to see the punchline here, and clearly failing to appreciate that sports don't have spirits. But let's pretend they do. Let's pretend all sports are ensouled at conception. Why would steroids specifically tarnish that soul, contravene that spirit? Regulatory rules are changing all the time in every sport. That doesn't interact with any souls. The entire sport is completely changed. A shot clock is added, the javelin is differently constructed, pads are incorporated into football uniforms. Every sport is in perpetual change to cater to a public in demand of newer and greater entertainments. In 1968, baseball was a pitcher's game. There were 339 shutouts that year. Bob Gibson had an ERA of 1.12. Don Drysdale pitched 58 2/3 consecutive scoreless innings. And Carl Yastrzemski was the only American League batter to break a 300 average. As an entertainment, that game wasn't meeting the public's demand. So they changed it. Mounds were dropped by 5 inches and strike zones were narrowed. The baseball of 1969 was not the baseball of 1968. It was a batter's game, a totally different sport. If baseball had a spirit, that would have contravened it first. In comparison, steroids don't actually change anything. They just improve the athleticism of the participants. And I've got news for you. Weight rooms and 21st century nutrition and sophisticated coaching that incorporates biomechanical analyses. These things improve athleticism even more. So how does one of those, steroids, tarnish the very soul of the sport, while the rest upset no fan? The usual answer to this question is that weight rooms and proper nutrition and sophisticated coaching are all natural endeavors, while steroids are unnatural, and the unnatural should play no part in sports if the wholesome is what we're after. I understand the logic here, and using that same logic, because sports are not natural, they should not be a part of athletics either. Sports don't exist in nature. They're not like grapes. They're human inventions. And what's more, with or without steroids, there's nothing natural about the way we train for them. Athletes transform themselves into the embodiment of their sport. Regardless of their natural body type, they manufacture a new one through vigorous training in completely unnatural ways so that they may better perform a series of unnatural movements. Although that by itself should be sufficient to reject the natural argument, we can do one better. This. Testosterone is natural. It's 100% natural. Conversely, there are plenty of unnatural substances that go unprotested. An example Peter Harmer gives is polymerized glucose. This is made in a lab, totally unnatural and completely legal. I've never seen anyone protest carbohydrate powder in sports. Or how about genetically modified food, GMOs? There's a different debate there. People just want their food packaging labeled so they know what unnatural foods are going into their mouths. But nobody's going to stop baseball players from eating those foods. Sorry, Alex Rodriguez, that corn is off the menu. Most of what we put in our bodies isn't really natural. Testosterone actually is. It's as natural as it gets. So if anyone was honestly concerned with what is or is not natural and the allowances in sport, GMOs would be banned and testosterone would be legal. But it wouldn't matter because the sports themselves would also be banned. The argument people attempt in opposition to this point is that steroids alter the natural course of something, and that's the problem. This gets a little bit abstract, but I'll splice in a very clear and pithy version of this argument. The following clip is from episode 56 of the Co-Main Event podcast on June 18th, 2013.
Okay. I almost don't even have the energy to go on a rant, almost. But, I get the things that people say, the explanations that they offer, that, hey, this is about making me feel better, and this is about improving my life and all that stuff. And it may be, they may see it that way, but I don't think that that's good enough. I don't think it's a good enough explanation for why you should be allowed to use steroids. I mean, the risks to other people of you doing that are too great. Just if you're sad, if you feel like you're getting old and life, has lost some of its flavor, that's what happens when you get old, goddammit. That's what happens. And hey, it's fine. If you're a regular citizen, you want to take some TRT and it makes you feel better and you're okay with being on that shit the rest of your life, fine.
And a second clip.
Right. And I think you made the point a few minutes ago, but it's a good one, that if you're a normal person, if you're my 62-year-old dad, for instance, it would be totally fine if you wanted to take testosterone to it's my dad, so I don't want to think about it, but whatever.
To get his doggy style back?
Yes, exactly. To get his doggy style back.
There's that mental image for you right there.
But these guys are professional athletes, and it's not like being a professional athlete is a right. It's a complete privilege, and if it turns out that you've gotten older and for one reason or another your body doesn't produce the same amount of testosterone that it used to produce when you were younger, I'm inclined to say tough shit in a professional athlete kind of a way. I don't think you should be able to just get jacked up on synthetic testosterone because you got old. That doesn't seem like a good enough excuse to me.
Well, and one of the things that athletic commissions do, if you come to them and you say, I have this condition, therefore I want to take this. One of the first questions that they ask is there a substitute? Is there something else you could take that would not be on the banned list that would perform the same function for you? And so it's like that's what stops it from you being able to say I have a fear of cages that might prevent me from competing in the UFC, but if I'm allowed to do LSD, my fear of cages disappears. And they'd be like, yeah, well, maybe you could take an anti-anxiety medication or something instead.
And that's the last clip. The podcast is good. The hosts are clever, but that's what happens when you get old is not a good reason. Our vision deteriorates with age, but nobody's villainizing the optometrist. We just get surgery, glasses, and contacts and fix it. Same thing with when our hearing goes. We go to the audiologist. When our endocrine system goes, how is that any different? And in response to, is there something else you could take that's not on the banned list? I don't think the answer to this question matters. What's illegal now was once legal. Just ask the Bulgarians. And anything that's effective now is likely to be made illegal in the future. With this in mind, why does following a very temporary and arbitrary set of rules matter? It's just silly, and silliness doesn't need to be taken seriously. Nor does any other argument that protests steroid use. The natural argument is completely backwards. The spirit argument is spoiled by the fact that sports don't have spirits, and even if they did, there's no reason why steroids would interact with those spirits. The unfair argument doesn't work because steroids are way more fair than practically every other component of every single sport in the world. The undue risk argument is ridiculous because it's the sports that are destroying the athletes, not the steroids. And we're not debating whether sports are undue risks that should be banned. And the coercion argument is just funny because no one you've ever met has ever been forced to compete at an elite level of anything. There's no valid argument against the use of steroids in sports. Everyone who opposes their use is either bitter that they weren't good enough to compete at an elite level, and they're making excuses as to why that was, or they think the person using steroids got something for nothing. The steroid user has skipped the part that involves work ethic and moved straight into the glory. But that's not how it works. If you do steroids and you don't work hard enough, nothing happens. You just have trouble peeing after a while. What steroids do, or at least do best, is enhance recuperative power. They don't create muscle, they allow you to train harder. So the people using steroids are probably training harder than you are. And the steroids are just helping them to do that. Some people will try to use steroids as a shortcut, but those people aren't getting their money's worth. You won't see their names in box scores, and you won't be mad at them because you can't even tell that they're on it, or that they did it. The people you'll be mad at are those that got something out of their steroids. And the people who get something out of their steroids are those that put everything into them. These people will do anything to succeed, side effects be damned. If eating their own feces mid-workout helped them train even harder, they would do that too. And this is fine because it doesn't hurt you. You're not suffering from vicarious liver toxicity, nor is anyone forcing you to compete against that person. So there's no reason why anyone should be upset or angered or somehow feel violated by anyone else's steroid use. It just comes down to pros and cons. Athletes weigh both and then make a choice. And they can make that choice by themselves. They don't need your help, and they certainly don't need your feedback. When I was in my athletic prime, I made that decision too, and I didn't need anyone's help in making it. I decided not to compete at that level. I, however, am fine with that. I'm not so embittered that I discredit other people by pretending that steroids are somehow unfair or unnatural. I just enjoy the show, and so should you. Although, if you feel like doing steroids and contributing to the show, I'll be entertained by that too. CourtneyJensen.com